art, physical media art, or a short story writing or anything like that. It's so personal, right?
Yeah.
And to actually get the gumption to submit it and put yourself out there and then just hear nothing, I think that a lot of times that's what leads people to kind of fall away from it, you know?
Right.
It's so deflating. The analog that makes me think of is as in what I did as a musician in my 20s and early 30s, like touring a lot as a musician. You hear about like bands that work so hard, they're on the road, they're pushing, they're building their fan base, and they start to get some notice. And they work with a label and they try to present so many songs, and they ultimately get passed over or something like that after, you know, this year or two of intense interest and working really hard to try to kind of win the game, and then not have it happen. It'll be so deflating that it just destroys the whole project altogether. And they end up looking back thinking like the worst thing that ever happened to us was that we had enough success to destroy the group, you know? It's different because it's a group dynamic, not an individual effort, but it sounds like you guys, that Kind Writers has kind of built into the constructs of how you work through submissions to ensure that if you're going to hear that it's not going to make it, you're going to hear it quickly or promptly, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, we do take a while to create the issue, but we do strive to communicate throughout the process. I mean, when you submit to us, you will hear back relatively quickly, and you are open to email us at any time, and you will probably get a response after, you know, a couple of days at best. You know, we try to have that line of communication. You know, in terms of getting it out quickly, I mean, I think initially we didn't anticipate getting as many submissions as we do. You know, and I think this sort of applies to any magazine, and I think it can sort of quell the discomfort that people feel. You know, for the second issue, we've received a little over 300 submissions. So, you know, it takes a while to sort of read through all of that. But again, the one thing that we want to emphasize is that we are there to support the artist, and we are open to inquiries. We're open to questions, you know.
How do you deal with submissions around art? I mean, I would think that even just the quality of the submission, you know, how it's photographed or something like that would have a lot to do with interest. Like, how do you get past the shortcomings of the photographer, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
I mean, generally, and I will say this, pretty much any work that, any visual art that's submitted, and if it's rejected, it's likely rejected for two reasons, or one of two reasons. One is that it doesn't fit the entire structure of the magazine itself, or two, that the photo quality is just very poor.
Very poor,
you know?
yeah.
I mean, if you have, let's say, a painting and the image is a little blurry, that's okay. You know, we may ask for like a higher resolution, but
right.
You know, we've had submissions where people sort of, you know, take a picture with their iPhone of the drawing on the coffee table, and you can see their living room, you know, and
right.
you can see all of this stuff, and you know, so long as you attempt to take a quality picture, it is going to be considered, you know. So what I want to say is that there is no, like, I've never looked at a work and just thought, wow, this is terrible, you know. At worst, I've looked at it and I thought, wow, this person didn't bother to take a quality picture of this.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you see past that and it makes it, then they go back and get it prepped properly for presentation.
Yeah.
Obviously. You mentioned bringing a piece of writing and of something to read.
Yes.
Tell me about that, and I'd love to if you'd like to.
Of course. So this is a story about sort of the aftermath of war, and I think that it in a way it sort of relates to the circumstances of my life, because there was the war in Armenia recently, and
give those who are listening a little bit of background on that in case they don't.
Right. So the recent war was over this sort of enclave area called Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians call it Artsakh. And this area has basically been in a sort of tug of war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And, long story short, during the Soviet Union, Stalin gave this piece of land to Azerbaijan, even though it held a majority Armenian population. And Armenia didn't like this, so, we sort of reclaimed it, but it was not legally recognized as a part of our territory. Mm-hmm. So the recent conflict was basically about Azerbaijan taking this area back, like, I guess, removing the Armenians and taking the territory back. So this story, I think, is not directly in response to that, but I think that it is a reflection of sort of my mental state during that process, given the background of the situation. So I was, with that going on, one afternoon I was listening to this post-rock song by, the band is called Godspeed You Black Emperor. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're familiar with.
I'm not.
No.
I know the name. I've heard the name.
Yeah, so I was listening to their song, and it's called Mountains Made of Steam. And I thought, that's a great, title for a story. Mm-hmm. I wonder if I can make a story out of that. So, this is basically the result of it.
Please, if you'd like.
Sure. Okay, so, Mountains Made of Steam. The blind man down the street had seen 1,000,000 sunsets. He said that white light is a beautiful thing, but it can be terrible too. The last time I spoke to him, he asked me what the Caspian Mountains looked like after the war. I told him they were covered by fog. It's like they're made of steam, I said. He scratched the gray stubble on his dark chin. I asked him if he had been in the war. Yes, I was blinded by a rocket. Never saw it coming, he said. I should have died like your daddy. He was lucky. Now he's an angel fighting for those steam mountains. I told him that was what my mama always told me. She's a smart woman, he said. My dad left behind a medal when he died. Neither me nor my brother Devin had ever seen it. Mama kept it in a small case above the fireplace. We were fascinated by it. Devin tried to steal it once, but was unable to get the case open. The day he grabbed the medal, he got all the way to the end of the front gate and squatted down in the dead grass. There, he struck the case with a loose piece of concrete. It made a muffled knocking sound each time he struck. When I found him, I told him to get back inside. We can't stay out too long, I said. Mama says the air isn't good. Don't tell her I'm out here. He struck the case. But Mama found him anyway. Ours wasn't a big house. She rushed out and grabbed his wrist, dragged him back inside. Devin sat on the couch while Mama scolded him about going outside without a mask. She gestured with the metal case still in her hand, and when she was done, she placed it on a high shelf we couldn't reach. The next morning, Devin found a beautiful silver bird with black eyes sitting on the same shelf. It had spent the night pecking at the case, and was pecking at it still when he called me to look. He shouted for me to come downstairs, and shortly after I arrived, the bird had trapped the case within its beak. Seeing a bird after the war was unexpected. They were thought to only live in the mountains beyond the city now. The bird, case in tow, flew out of the window, and my brother ran straight for the door without hesitation. "Come on," he shouted, with tears in his eyes. I paused for a moment, but ran after him anyway. The sun was clouded over. A thick fog covered the streets and mountains. The morning street stood silent save for the sound of footsteps. They clapped against the concrete and splashed in the muddy puddles that filled the bomb craters. We ran past the deserted houses and the rubble littering the sidewalks. The bird flew sporadically. After passing the blind man's house at the end of the block, it perched on a metal rod, rising above a pile of rubble. As soon as it came within a few feet, it took flight again. I had trouble keeping up with Devin. He was faster than me, and after passing the first block, I began to cough a lot. He heard me hacking and told me I should go home, but I refused. The air smelled of smoke and sulfur. We scarcely saw anyone walking outside. The few people that we did see were the elderly walking with canes and breathing through filtered masks. It was impossible to tell where they were going or why. There were no children. The silver bird reached the church ruins and flew up, landing on the peak of the structure where the cross once stood. Devin and I stood before the ravaged steps and looked up at the case glistening in its beak. The sun slyly peeked through the clouds and formed a halo around the silver bird. The case, in turn, shone with cutting illumination. It was difficult to look at directly. "I'm going for it," Devin said. Before I could protest, he ran up the stairs and through the decrepit archway. I ran after and entered what remained of the building. Half the roof was missing, and the loose stones were caked in layers of dust. We climbed the rubble, reached for the stone, steel, and wood, each motion kicking up the dust and blending it with the fog, thickening the air and making it harder to breathe. The roof was shingled and had several protruding beams, each bent and twisted from the heat of the fallen bombs. The beams were thick steel, but appeared to have been at one time melted like butter. Devin mounted the beams closest to us and walked it like a tightrope over the vast chasm at the center of the roof. He told me to wait, but I followed him anyway. The chasm below appeared like an ever-widening abyss of twisted metal and jagged rock. Devin jumped across a gap between beams and landed unsteadily on the narrow steel surface. I leapt and followed him across, barely latching onto the beam with my hands. I kicked my feet and desperately tried to pull up. "Devin," I yelled. "Help!" My brother was squatting by the edge of the roof. His attention was fixed squarely on the silver bird, the case in its beak. He reached out farther and farther as I struggled to lift myself up the beam. When I finally managed to swing my feet onto the metal surface, Devin was gone. I scanned the abandoned streets in search of my brother from the roof of the church, seeing nothing but fog and the intermittent shine of the metal case. I picked it up. Its latch was broken. We had reached our prize. I opened the case. It was full of blood.
Wow, thank you for reading that.
Of course. My pleasure.
cutting illumination